This is a new sitting period. We just started 2 days ago. It's not going to be a long one. It will be until 12th of December, and we aim and we want this sitting period to focus on the PDP bill. So hopefully we will make some progress within the last sitting period before New Year comes. The bill itself has been passed by the president in January this year, and in February we started discussing it in the first committee together, of course, with the government, which is the Ministry of Communication, and also some other Mendagri and Menkumham, also assigned by the government to represent the government to talk with first committee in DPR or the House of Representatives. Why we would prioritize in this bill, of course, you know, and I believe that our president has also spoken in this forum, that it is clear that Indonesia want to do a transformation in digital sector to also boost our economy. And the president has been saying that in many occasions, and of course with the rapid growth of digitalization that is happening in Indonesia, along with that also, of course, come the needs to protect data. We also know, and the parliament also noted very well, there are some cases of massive data breach or disclosure of the mishandling personal data that, as we know, recently happened. And these cases also remind us of what is fear to protect the functioning of our data-driven economy. So we now have people want to see their privacy protected, consumers who want their data to be safe. In turn, business also recognize that strong privacy protection can in fact give them a competitive advantage as confidence in their services increases. And clearly we should use the data to create better public services, conducting scientific research, preventing and eradicating terrorism and other criminal networks. As you mentioned about the financial sector, in relation with that, financial sector has been a vital sector that put into account in the making of the personal data protection bill, because we believe this sector, especially fintech, requires personal data for anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist financing, as well as for credit scoring purposes. And against that backdrop, we believe that it is pivotal to also include fintech within the discussion on the personal data protection bill. And therefore, we've called AFTECH and some other associations of fintech to provide their inputs on personal data protection bill in July 6th, 2020, or this year. There's also one thing to note, which is because the figure, we just cannot miss the figure in terms of e-commerce in Indonesia, which has grown very significantly. It has actually increased 12 times the size as it should be likely to develop. In 2015, Indonesia recorded a transaction of 1.7 billion US dollars. In 2019, Indonesia's e-commerce transaction reached 21 billion US dollars, or equivalent to 294 trillion rupiah. But unfortunately, those figures do not reflect the confidence level that the e-commerce users or consumers feel about doing e-commerce. So all that, of course, come into account that this law has to be taken priority. And if you mention about the, what do you call that, the terms, we are unable to discuss specific terms and perhaps different point of view between the government and the parliament yet in this very early stage of our discussion with the parliament. But so far, we have, there are actually about 371 discussion points that need to be resolved with the government, and we have already passed 80 out of it. So we are doing good, and I think by next year we should have the law already being able to be passed. Leslie.
That's remarkable. Thank you so much, Ibu Mutia, for sharing with us the journey. I understand that you've been working hard at it, and we appreciate the rigors that you put in place. And I'm also very curious about the critical elements of data governance that can help accelerate digitalization in financial services.
Sorry, the critical
elements of the data. So can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great, great. I would love to understand from your point of view, what are the critical elements of data governance that can help accelerate digitalization in financial services?
Of course, we're still working on it in the bills, but how we are going to protect, for example, the algorithm, will it be open? Can people, what do you call that, process data? That is something that we still discuss very thoroughly within the committee. Of course, Leslie, we want and we know that digitalization can move faster if we don't put so much restrictions on the law. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, that we have also inputs that people want their data to be protected, and they want their privacy to be to remain private, and we also have to take that into consideration. So we will try to meet in the middle, Leslie.
It is a tough balancing act. I fully understand, and because I've seen how Singapore has gone through with that journey. I also on the board of directors for Singapore GovTech, and the personal data protection journey has been quite a lengthy one as well. So I can only appreciate the amount of rigors that you have put in place to go forward with this. I do also understand that you have a time constraint due to the last minute change of our event schedule. So we really appreciate your time here today to share your experience. Is there any parting thoughts you would like to share with this audience before you leave?
I think I've covered all, but when we speak about data protection, of course, we hear inputs from a very wide range of inputs, especially from the millennials and from the non-millennials. They have different concerns. And maybe I highlight again what I mentioned earlier. We strongly believe that we should pass a law that should give much freedom to the industries, including fintech, to grow as fast as they can, because we know that in Indonesia, we also need that. We need to boost the economy. But at the same time, because the first committee do not only deal with ICT, but also defense. So we also have things to protect, not only the privacy of our citizens, but also the, a good defense for the whole country in terms of protecting our country's data privacy. So again, we try to balance between those inputs, and hopefully the best will be resulted in our discussion. But Leslie, as you mentioned, other countries have been doing also great jobs, and we will of course do benchmarking from what is happening with the laws in other countries, including Singapore.
That's wonderful. That's good to know. And we would love to hear the progress over time. And I really appreciate you for sharing with us the balanced approach in order to encourage innovation while managing and regulating risk proportionally. So thank you so much for your contribution to this panel.
It's a great event. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Honor to meet you as well. All the best to this the bill. and we'll keep track of the progress. So thank you so much, Ibu Mutia, for joining us. And we'd like to now also pass on to Pak Bobby to share with us his experience from the government point of view, advising the Ministry of Finance. Pak Bobby, over to you, please.
Thank you, Leslie. I would like to start with something that, yes, the regulation is necessary, but in the end of the day, it's the execution that matters, right? You know,
Absolutely.
the people that manage the system and also the technology that will, you know, process, you know, all of those data. Nowadays, technologies can be, you know, developed, can be bought, you know, relatively easily. But managing people that understand the regulation is not that easy. So with that, I think the human factor is you have to, you know, pay attention to that. Like what we did in the Ministry of Finance, we had a series of awareness program to make sure that, you know, people understand why data, what does it mean by data is an asset? You know, why do you have to protect the data? I mean, I do remember that there's a story about somebody building a house with a strong fence, but the people within the house are not really careful about, you know, keeping their important information, right? So when somebody calls about that and they share the password of you know, of the fence, then that strong fence doesn't make any difference, right? So I guess that's what I'd like to add on to Bu Mutia explanation, Bu Leslie, that in addition to the regulation, you also need the human factor and also, of course, the technology.
That's great comments. I fully support what you're saying, because the digitalization process is a journey, and it is a combination of proportional regulation, technology, innovation, as well as the human elements, capacity building, changing the mindset and the culture in order for all of that to come together, people, process, and technology. So well said, Pak Bobby. I know we've been in that journey for quite some time together. So yes, really appreciate the guidance over the years with your thought leadership, and also your careful planning from the governance perspective to help us forge ahead in the journey. Now, from drawing upon from your years of experience in this space on the digitalization work at Ministry of Finance, what do you think would be some of the key lessons learned that you could share with us as we embark on the frontier, you know, at building towards post-COVID recovery with the future passing of the law for PDP?
I mean, like I said before, the awareness is one thing, right? And secondly is, you know, enforcing. Once the law is in place, you have to make sure that all parties related to that needs to comply with that, right? So I think, you know, enforcing digital environment is not that easy, right? Because I mean, it's different from the physical environment in which you can see, you can touch the object. Here, the data is there, right? Even if somebody tells you that somebody is stealing the data, but it's there in your disk, right? So how could you say that it's stolen, right? So enforcing it will need a different approach, I guess, especially for the fintechs to be, you know, developed further. So I was thinking about the model like what we do in the corporation, in which each year you do a financial audit to make sure that the audit processes that they do complies to the regulation, you know, because you cannot just say, I set up these things and it's once for all, right? Because what you think is secure for now may not be secure tomorrow, right? What you think is the data is protected, it may not be like that, you know, once the technology is developed. So having a periodic checkup, like like financial audit on your IT systems, would surely increase that assurance, both to the providers and the consumers. So we can really have a greater assurance that our data is protected. And as far as to who should do this audit, I think it's just like financial audit, right? The government set up regulation on what needs to be complied, and then based on that, the IT auditors can do audit from time to time to any service providers to make sure that they comply with that. Yeah, that's my my response, Leslie.
Great wisdom. Thank you, Pak Bobby. I understand that you also have a time constraint as well. So we value your input, and your advice resonates with me because with many of these systems that we are working with, they're high complexity, and therefore the need to continuously make sure that it's up to date, making sure that all these checkpoints are in place to ensure the safeguards and that we do not just set it and forget about it. So I think your advice is very well taken, and we appreciate your contribution to this panel as well. Look forward to our continued collaboration as it has been a wonderful experience. And I wish you a good health and stay safe.
You too.
Thank you so much, Pak Bobby.
Thank you, Leslie, and I'm apologize. I have to leave now, so see you later then. Yeah, bye-bye.
All right, take good care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So now we would like to turn the attention to the private sector. I think this is a fantastic way of setting the scene from the government's point of view, understanding more around the regulation. So I'd like to turn over to Vivek. I know you have a regional leadership role. Perhaps you could also share with us, from your point of view, what are the critical elements of the data governance that can help accelerate digital transformation in financial services sector?
Yeah, so thanks so much, Leslie, and thanks to AFTECH for having me at this interesting and important forum. So one is, I think what's going to be critical is that data or the information can be seamlessly transferred between different parties and therefore used. And then you need a framework to make that happen. The second point I want to say is that data is not a zero-sum game. I think data is an asset that we need to recognize that can be used and reused and reused. So unlike a lot of other assets, I think it needs to be viewed differently. But then that obviously comes with the challenge that how do you protect people's rights? How do you protect people's sort of their privacy? And that's really, so that's the second element. The third is that just like you need raw materials to grow in the manufacturing sector, I would argue that after you've got a basic digital infrastructure, data is probably the fuel that you need to make that sector grow, whether it's e-commerce, fintech, edutech. So that's, again, the importance that data is going to play. And therefore, the governance factors that surround it are going to be critical. Now, there is a sense, and I think you alluded to it earlier, that you need to balance out innovation and sort of entrepreneurship with protecting people's rights under data. I would argue that at one level in the immediate term, yes, one can argue that it's one against the other. But if you were to look at the medium term, I think it's going to be equally critical for us to be able to innovate a lot more, that you have adequate data protection. Because the last thing that we want is an event which causes the entire sector to go back a few years because the impact of that has been so severe. So rather than going at cross purposes, I believe that we need to start viewing data protection and the critical elements that go into it as an essential ingredient to encourage even more innovation in the longer term. The third, obviously, is going to be the regulatory aspect and how is it sort of, which is the body that will manage this whole process and the importance of applying these laws equally to the public sector, to the private sector, a level playing field, and having preferably an autonomous body like we have in Singapore, like we have in the Philippines, which can manage this. And the reason I say that is because all these things ultimately, they have to inspire confidence and trust in the consumer. It's my data, it's your data that is at risk. And we as the consumers and the population at large need to have that confidence that A, it will be managed appropriately, and B, if there is a problem, there are remedies that can resolve these issues. Thanks.
Well said on building confidence, trust in the consumer, the citizens. So actually, this is a great segue to Nikki, because Nikki wears two hats in this panel. One is the chairman of AFTECH, a self-regulating organization, and of course, a private sector on the other hand, for Vida, for founder of a very interesting fintech. So perhaps you could comment from either side of your role, what's your perspective on this PDP bill coming up?
I think the personal data protection bill is very critical for establishing basically trust, right? Trust between consumers and financial institutions and fintech companies and financial service providers. It's I think very important, especially in now's day and age, is how are you going to use my data, right? What are the limitations of how will my data be used? Is that going to be done transparently to me? Are you going to get my consent before you use my data? I think those are just some basic things of how to break down what personal data protection means, and to make sure that we also have a framework of laws to hold people who are storing that sensitive data, even when they have been provided that consent, that it's done so responsibly. It's done with the right security standards. As earlier as Pak Bobby and Vivek have been mentioning, we need to make sure that there's appropriate protections and appropriate security to make sure this data does not get misused, that this data does not leak, and as a result of that, lose the trust of so many consumers that the industry has continued to fight to get their trust in the first place, to just go digital, to be able to move that way. So I think personal data protection is a critical element of evolving to the digital economy, to evolving to digital financial services. It's a basic contract between a citizen, and normally this is something that is done when we go physically. So this is not a new concept. Go to a bank today. We sign physically with a wet signature. We sign consent that there are certain terms and conditions that we agree to, and we're aware about how our data should be used. But I think nowadays, especially with more and more analytics, which I think is a great thing. It's a great thing to be able to personalize finance, but at the same time, with more and more applications, we need to be more careful and more transparent so that we can continue to protect the valuable trust that's been built between consumers and financial service providers.
That's well said. I'm also curious about, from your role as chairman of AFTECH, AFTECH's role as a self-regulating organization, how could that really help with a bill of this nature?
So I think we've been very lucky to have a very progressive government. The Indonesian government under President Jokowi's administration has been extremely progressive in terms of thinking about how to foster an environment that stimulates innovation. And I think some of those basic principles come down to light touch and safe harbor. In other words, letting innovation happen and being able to create a safe place for experimentation, creating a safe place for innovation, and making sure that the industry can be flexible and grow and not overly regulate before there's actually something there yet. So making sure we don't create too many rules until there's clearly an industry, and there's growth, and we're solving the core problem of access to financial services first. So I think this is a very progressive view. From an AFTECH perspective, I think we've been very blessed to have gained a lot of trust by working together hand in hand with the regulators for a number of years now, and focusing a lot on policy and being able to contribute the industry's views. And we do a lot of work. We mobilize a lot of resources from the private sector, from each of the different companies, to be able to study regulations, benchmark other countries, and see how other ecosystems have been developed, and provide concrete recommendations, whether it's on the actual laws that are being that exist, or new laws that are being proposed, and being able to give the industry's feedback in a consolidated voice, so that it's really clear. I think sometimes we may all have the same intention, but different jargon, different language, and that's what AFTECH tries to streamline, so we can harmonize our message. And I think at the end of the day, that's one key factor of AFTECH. But beyond that, we've recently been given the role of a self-regulatory organization by OJK for digital financial services innovation. And I think this is where our role now is to try and proactively build industry guidelines. I think there are already a lot of great examples that are being adopted by the majority of players. But I think this is where, again, we need to create a clear level playing field amongst all players, and ensure that consumer protection, for example, is always at top of mind and is never compromised. So areas such as data security, personal data protection, are areas that we not only will advocate, but we will also actually take an active role in monitoring, developing accreditation programs, coming up with technical workshops to explain to practitioners, how do you exactly implement data security? What are the right data security standards that are relevant to each fintech vertical? At what stage do you need to step up certain things like your cybersecurity, right? So these are areas such as, and there are very tangible solutions. These are solutions of today that we also are talking about, some cutting edge solutions of leveraging biometrics and public key infrastructure to build multi-factor authentication, so that, you know, issues that were discussed earlier today around some of the cybersecurity threats that are out there, the weaknesses and vulnerabilities around OTPs and one-time passwords, and being able to compromise accounts and take account takeovers and suck money out of people's accounts, doesn't happen. So these are areas that collectively we can share a lot of knowledge with each other. And more importantly, collectively, we can agree as an industry to be proactive, to take those steps before regulation has to come. And as an industry, we can be proactive to, first and foremost, protect that precious trust that consumers have given us, and make sure that as an industry, we can help prove that these concepts work, and we can adopt the latest technologies to not only improve security, but hopefully more importantly for a lot of the practitioners, improve the user experience, make it more seamless, make it more frictionless, make adoption of digital financial services even easier and better. So I think that's the areas that from an AFTECH perspective, it is a volunteer organization. We encourage everyone to get involved, and there is a lot of expertise that we have, and really it's a spirit of, you know, a rising tide. We all pitch in, gotong royong, we all carry a weight together, and together we can move mountains.
That's true leadership. I always admire the way you say a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think that's so true. That kind of spirit really helps bring about the high level rigors in the whole entire ecosystem. And thank you for your leadership in this space to bring about this kind of new standards and innovation as well. So I actually wanted to turn over to Vivek to talk about what the success looks like when this bill is passed, drawing upon your experience from so many countries in the region.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. So like I said earlier, success would look like, basically that people's rights and privacy are protected. At the same time, to reiterate what I said earlier, that we don't really compromise on innovation and competition. And the term I want to use here is responsible innovation, because at the end of the day, I think that's important, that people, when they're innovating, they really get that into account. They really take that into account. Yeah. Again, like I said earlier, the enforcement and implementation should very critically apply to public and private institutions. I think that's important that we sort of make sure that that happens. Talking what that it fosters trust. Very important is consumer education, and I'll spend a few minutes on this because consumers should understand what does it mean when they click on that button which says I accept. The number of times I'm ordering something on an e-commerce site, and right at the end, when I'm getting desperate, I want to check out, go into something else, this thing pops up and says, do you accept blah, blah, blah. And, we don't read it, to be honest, most of the time. So for people to understand, what does it mean when they're agreeing to share their data? For people to understand, what does it mean when their kids are signing up to that? Very important in this day and age. Yeah. And at the same time, really, not only what are the risks they're exposing themselves to, but they also need to understand what are the benefits they're going to get if they're part of this new digital ecosystem, this fast evolving, huge digital ecosystem that's coming about. What does it mean if you're not going to be part of it? And also for them to understand what are the remedies they have. What if there has been a breach of data? What does it mean for me? So really that whole consumer education piece is important here. And the last thing I want to mention, successfully, you can have perfect laws, but implementation is critical. And here also, I think industry has to play a role. It's just not the regulators and the government, but industry also has to start looking at data protection at a much earlier stage. It should not be an afterthought. It should really come in at design stage. When you're designing an app or when you're designing something, is really, are we looking at data protection from the beginning? And I would argue going forward, it should be one of the foundations. Like when you're constructing a building, you make sure that the underground seams and the foundations are strong. I would argue going forward, data protection and privacy should be one of those foundations in the digital ecosystem that we're talking about. Thanks.
Those are all very good, very great points. But I'm also curious about who should be the one monitoring the implementation. And you mentioned that's a critical part, right, for the personal data protection principles.
So, I mean, each country has different ideas on how they want to do it. And, but there are some good examples out there, which I think you had alluded to and I'll allude to. The Philippines, Singapore, the way it's being done there, I would argue. And there are, I'm sure, a number of other good examples. And, it's always hard on how should this be regulated and who should regulate it. Now, the best case scenario is it should be an autonomous body. Typically, an autonomous body, I would hope, does not take sides in one way or another, and it's neutral, and its best interest is to see that the consumers get a fair hearing and a fair deal. So it should preferably be an autonomous body. But I would also add that sometimes this is a journey. We may not be getting there, and without sort of getting into too much detail, it sometimes could be a journey. But at the same time, I would argue that when we've got good examples of how it's being done in other markets, I would really encourage countries across the ASEAN to try and learn from each other. And like an old boss of mine used to say, it's okay to make a mistake, but don't make a mistake when somebody else has made the same mistake. So I hope that we can collectively learn from each other. And this is a playbook that's not fully evolved. This is a playbook that's, I wouldn't say it's starting out, but it's progressing fast. And we're all going to learn as we go along. But I ultimately think it's better if it's an autonomous body which is regulating this. Thanks.
Right. I would agree with you. I think that's been the best practices from many other examples around the world. Since you mentioned ASEAN, I actually wanted to kind of double click on that. Given that it's data protection policy, it's not just for a given country, but also let's think about cross-border implication and what are the potential of unlocking data flows from one country to another and into the whole region. So I think that is value in making sure that the opportunity to share data fluidly across border and then to enhance the regional growth for digital economy is critical. Would love to get both your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so that's something very close to my heart. I'm a big believer in the ASEAN. The ASEAN, if it were one economic unit, would be, as a population, the third largest country in the world after China and India. And I think, at least from an economic perspective, that's the way I would love to view it. Yeah. So if the governments which are looking at the digital space say, okay, instead of a country with a 70 million population, Thailand, or 90 million Myanmar, or 270 million Indonesia, were to try and say that this is a 700 million, I think it's 6 or 700 million, give or take a little bit. Let's look at it as one economic unit. I think the benefits that would accrue, I would argue, at least in the medium term, would far outweigh the costs of sharing data. Now, I know there are sensitivities, there are national interests involved, there are security interests, and those have to be taken care of. No two ways on that. I mean, we have to build that into these kind of things, because I don't think any country would be willing to compromise their national security. And it's integral to the growth of the sector going forward. But if it were to be viewed as one comprehensive economic unit, and flow of data is made easier, and regulations are harmonized, it's very important. I mean, I'll just deviate a bit and talk about, if you were to have a highway from Myanmar through to Malaysia, and each little bit of the highway, whether it's Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, or Myanmar, or whichever country it's going to be running through, has different laws governing their particular stretch, it ain't going to work in the long run, because if there's a default in one particular stretch, the entire highway can't work. So similarly, I think it's important that we try and harmonize some of these laws that are coming up, that we try and harmonize policies and regulations to the extent possible, and try and view this as one economic unit. I firmly believe that the benefits in the medium term will far outweigh the costs that you may have to incur in the short term to make it happen. So getting data across borders is just as important, as, in my view, as getting goods and services across borders. And we've seen the benefit of that as countries have opened their borders, what impact that's had to economic growth when they've allowed free flow of information, free flow of products, free flow of technology. I think the results are quite clear there. Thanks.
That is so well said. Perhaps, Nikki, you can also weigh in on that, because we've discussed this at great length about what are the potential if there's a way for that to happen and facilitate that cross-border bilateral and multilateral opportunity for free trade on digital data. Would you like to comment on that, Nikki?
Yes, I mean, I would not only fully agree with Vivek. I think, to make the point a little bit stronger, it's already happening, right? So if you're looking at the digital ecosystem, it's already connected. If you look at all of the more scaled startups, the more scaled technology companies out of Indonesia, for example, many in terms of ride-hailing, e-commerce, online travel agents, just to name a few examples, let alone fintech, of course. Many are already operating in multiple markets across ASEAN. So it's already happening. And this is across Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and this is already happening. So what the point is today is, okay, what are we going to do about it? Because at the end of the day, despite the fact that the regulations are not quite harmonized yet, and despite the fact that it's not that easy, and there are, quote unquote, these broken highways, we're still pushing forward, because it's clear that the demand is there. It's clear that this is what consumers want, and this is the future of the digital economy, and it will happen. Now, the question is, can we remove some of those roadblocks? Can we smooth out that highway? Can we start to remove some of the bumps in the road so that we can start moving much faster, right? So I think the evolution of the digital economy is clear. The path is clear. Now it's about, well, how do we remove as many of these roadblocks so that we can help reap the benefits that is very clear. And, I think there's very simple examples, between Singapore and Indonesia. There's friends who have have a food craving of something in Singapore that will order it to Indonesia and to Jakarta and vice versa. And something as simple as a bowl of noodles, something as simple as some of their favorite home cooked foods that, you know, it just reminds them of home. And this is already happening. It's all happening informally. Now imagine what we could do, especially, you know, today, the bigger tech companies, the larger unicorns, etc., they're already doing it, but they have a lot more funding. They have a lot more resources. Now imagine if we were to remove those barriers. Think about SMEs, somebody who's just selling a very humble bowl of noodles, whether it's in Indonesia, in Jakarta, selling a bowl of bakmi, or it's in Singapore, someone selling bak chor mee, right? It's something that these little things actually can bring an immense amount of value and just make our whole economies and make it flow faster, make it flow better. And I think this is where it's not just about ride hailing and, you know, the big e-commerce platforms and I think those areas, but I think the real challenge is how do we make this digital economy, the opportunity of a digital economy, accessible to even your small mom and pops who are not very digitally savvy? And how does the industry work together to overcome the regulations? And beyond overcoming the regulations, how do we work together and collaborate, you know, with a few different specialized providers, whether it's somebody who can provide the commerce platform, somebody that provides the logistics, the payments, and manage the entire supply chain to connect each other and let the data flow, because it needs to. But let's make sure that it's clear where that goes and that people can be held accountable to make sure it's used properly, only for what it was intended for. So I think this is the area that cross-border is definitely happening. If you look at, especially at, you know, this has been happening, in fact, for a long time. If you look at foreign domestic workers who go abroad and send money home for remittances, this has been one of the primary fintech use cases for a very, very long time. Now, these are just a few education of students going abroad and going to other markets, right? So there's a number of different segments beyond the very digital native, you know, the really millennials who want to do all the shopping online and live in, get everything now and have more options. But if we look around the ASEAN region, this is a very promising region. We have a demographic surplus. We have a lot of creative entrepreneurs coming up with unique and beautiful business ideas and models that together, I think, as a region could really unite us.
I think that's very well said. I also like the way you are talking about giving opportunity for the small, medium enterprises, not just the big players, to level the playing field. Because I'm working on a few things related to agri-tech, and Indonesia agri-tech is booming. And one day I would love to see the smallholder farmer being able to produce the local products. You know, I heard that the durians in Indonesia is actually quite amazing, but so little of it is exported out of Indonesia. And maybe one day companies like a Tani Hub in Indonesia could be able to export some of these from the smallholder farmers to other parts of ASEAN, so that others can also experience the great produce in Indonesia, going from a consumption economy to an export of these local agriculture goods and products overseas. I think that would be a wonderful thing for the digital ecosystem. Now, I also learned from other examples in Singapore, how Singapore and Australia did an interesting digital economy agreement recently that talks about explicit cross-border data flow as part of the agreement, and spelled out clearly, including source code protections and the right governance framework for enhancing digital trade, which I think is a brilliant example in the modern world of cross-border agreements. So I think what you've just described are great examples of what are the potentials when we get to that point of being able to transact securely, building confidence and trust, not just within the country, but cross-border. I wanted to also ask both of you about the right monitoring mechanism and the private sector role in this space, given your experience in this area. How can the whole community and the whole ecosystem bring about a high level of maturity in this space to protect consumer rights and private personal data protection going forward?
Okay, let me go first. So I think first and foremost, you know, you talk about monitoring systems, you need to have a very strong framework or a legal framework. So sort of the rules have to be very clearly enshrined. And then that is also to give power to the independent, I think for want of a better word, data protection authority. And there are good examples of that. I think the EU has the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and there are OECD guidelines which can be used in that. The second, like I said earlier, is the importance of an independent authority, because this authority has to monitor implementation. It has to protect the citizens and again, ensure that both public and private institutions are being treated fairly and it's a level playing field here. And then the second part of that is the ability to hear or receive grievances and how to resolve them. And one thing to sort of look at there is whether there should be some sort of arbitration mechanism or an out-of-court way to resolve some of these issues. Court systems in most countries today are pretty clogged, and I would argue sometimes, you know, you may spend an enormous amount of time. And again, if you're a citizen who's fighting a case, and here I'm going to be very blunt, against a huge multi-million or a multi-billion-dollar company, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know the legal sort of heavyweights that they can employ to argue against a normal citizen. So again, a sort of an arbitration mechanism could be important. And then there's also the importance of self-regulatory organizations, you know, which may want to develop their own monitoring systems, sort of more self-regulation than anything else. I mean, industry obviously has to be a key stakeholder to make sure that they can also self-monitor, like I said earlier. And, you know, to reiterate what I said is the importance of incorporating this at design stage in what you do. And last but not least is a system which can resolve these grievances very quickly. I mean, we should not get bogged down. See, at the end of the day, let's recognize and acknowledge mistakes will happen. Things happen which are beyond our control. So it's not about, you know, we all learn from our mistakes, like I said earlier, but we don't want to be in a situation where we get bogged down in there was a data breach here or my data was incorrectly shared. So I think having a sort of an arbitration body that can resolve these disputes quickly, I think is going to be very important in order for us to be able to move forward. And the private sector is going to play a role at different parts of this clearly. But I think they will play a critical role going forward, because I believe it's in the interests of the technology companies to make sure that this is done correctly in order for them to succeed in the longer term. It's really what I call the sustainability of the tech sector, where a manufacturing company has to ensure that their emissions are right, that what they're doing, the usage of water, the pollution, the you know, things like that, sort of. And we think a lot on those lines in the IFC is a manufacturing sector, because that's. But I would say this is one of the things which is, I would call one of the. If there were SDGs for the technology sector, I would put that as one of the SDGs, to be honest. Thanks.
Great. So I wanted to open up to the audience to ask questions, and hoping that they will post a question on the chat window so we can pick them up here. While they're thinking about the question, maybe I'll kind of ask you both to reflect on what we have discussed today. What are some of the key things that, you know, if in the perfect world, if you would love to see some of these changes happen in addition to the PDP bill, what are the most enabling environments that really would foster the greatest innovation in Indonesia going forward? since this is one of the best opportunity to get the great thought leaders here, and you have a great captive audience, would you like to share some of your wish lists?
Yeah, I think for me personally, the FinTech Association is a self-organized, self-funded initiative. It's a volunteer initiative. And I think first and foremost, just want to say thank you to all of the members of AFTECH for putting in and donating so much of their valuable time and volunteering their time and volunteering their expertise in each of these areas. And as Vivek was saying, this is actually in our own self-interest to make sure that our industry is sustainable. That same way, and maybe to go back to the example of manufacturing, if you are manufacturing food products, you need to make sure that there's proper health and safety protocols. Otherwise, you may compromise that trust with your consumers and in the end, it's going to cost you your business. So this is something that from the technology sector, we view that, hey, we also need to take adequate safety measures. And in our situation, that safety measure is around data protection. It's around data security. It's around cybersecurity standards. And I think today it's upon all of us, right? I think the more, what fraudsters take advantage of is the fact that we don't coordinate well enough, that we don't discuss together what are the solutions, and that we don't adopt them quickly. Because very simply put, I think earlier today, we had a white hacker expose some of the biggest issues in Indonesia around phishing, around malware, around social engineering. And the reality is all of these issues, or at least 95% of these issues, can be addressed by implementing multi-factor authentication. And that there are standard, global standards around this. There are global standards about how to combat this kind of fraud. And it's very well understood how this happens, why, and how to prevent it. So this is where from AFTECH, we also, I think, want to encourage, call to action as many of you industry practitioners to get involved for the sustainability of our industry. And I think beyond that, the concrete deliverables is that there's plenty of us that are responsible. There's plenty of us that are doing it the proper way. Let's ensure that everyone is held accountable to those same standards. And let's make sure, more importantly, that consumers understand how to differentiate someone who's properly following, the minimum standards and someone who's not. And more importantly, somebody who's implementing best practice. The same way that if you want to understand if an airline is safe to fly, there's a Skytrax rating, or you want to stay at a hotel, the difference between a 3-star, 4-star, and 5-star hotel. And the same thing with an airline on Skytrax. Now that's something that AFTECH is trying to implement and make sure that there's a fair, transparent process to be able to get accredited and recognized for implementing best practice work. And hopefully at the end of the day, give consumers more peace of mind that, oh, okay, I know, with this 5-star fintech provider, I don't have to worry about my data. I'm in good hands and they do things properly and ethically. I think that ultimately is what we need, but it really takes the entire community to work together, mobilize together, and say, hey, we're not going to take the shortcut. Let's play the long game. Let's make sure we're in it for the long term, and invest our time in things that sometimes, especially as startup founders, say, oh, I don't have enough time in the day to be able to talk about regulations. I don't have enough time to be able to talk about standards, right? So these are areas that I think they're worthwhile investments, especially if we do them all together.
Good point. So we get a few questions from the audience here. One of them is, what are the impact of the draft bill when it's implemented for the private sector?
I think one of the impacts of the draft bill is defining very clearly data ownership, accountability, and ensuring that proper consent has been obtained for what data, and making sure that that's transparent. So I think that is one area that is an immediate impact. I think the second part, which may take a little bit more time because it requires enforcement, is there is a penalty. In the event of a breach, the penalty can be up to 4% of revenues of that service provider. So it's a big penalty. Most margins in the tech space, you're not talking about 4% of revenue. So this is something that there is a clear penalty. And I think it's both. Now, I think from AFTECH point of view, we don't want to just, I think it's always, the compliance push is always a strong one, but I think we also want to make sure that there's a carrot, that people who do invest their time and effort to implement it well are recognized and can get that 5-star rating, if you will. So these are a few areas that for us, I think is really important. And just to at least start the discussion and start raising the consumer awareness of, hey, is this a licensed fintech provider? I think one very basic question, and being able to check on our website, okay, this fintech provider has been properly registered, properly licensed, and at least gone through some level of due diligence and some level of audit. And being able to know the difference of when somebody's registered, so they fulfilled minimum criteria, to when they're licensed, when they've actually gone through a rigorous audit and they have a series of certifications by independent bodies to verify and validate that, in fact, they are running and operating by best practice, not just having a manual, not just having a bunch of SOPs, but making sure that that's what happens every day.
That's a good point. Thank you very much for the great response. There's another question that came in to ask how the association in Indonesia can contribute to build data governance. And so they're commenting on the fact that abroad, the associations are self-regulating. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, so I think right now we have a personal data protection task force at AFTECH. We have a working group that convenes on a weekly basis. In fact, since for more than a year now, and we already are issuing a code of conduct. In fact, during this event. So what we wanted to do is make sure that even though the personal data protection bill hasn't officially come out yet, it doesn't mean that we can't issue our own industry guidelines, and they are actually all in line with RUU PDP. And this is an area that hopefully, we can start getting a head start and helping everyone understand what these bills mean and what that impact is operationally, technically, hosting not only the broader area of understanding the code of conduct, understanding the principles, and a little bit more of the detailed requirements, but all the way until technical workshops of what kinds of solutions can you look for from what types of service providers that are, and the level and the different levels and degrees of qualifications that different service providers have, and trying to make that all transparent and available even on our website. So these are a few things that are happening. So again, it's not just about building the data governance, the policy, of course, and the framework has to be there, but sometimes the challenge is the implementation, the socialization, the education, and making it easy for consumers to understand, how do I stay protected? How do I stay safe?
Great points. In fact, there's another question that the audience is asking about, a starting kit that they need before creating a startup to provide personal data protection.
And so there's ethical, there's the code of conduct, and there's a few industry standards. I think a very basic one in terms of data security is ISO 27001. That's a very clear global standard. I think that's a basic standard, and we can pick it up from there. And then depending on the different verticals, I think there's different areas of complexity. There are things all the way until GDPR level of compliance. Those international standards exist. That's ISO 27701. So there's a few different things out there, but I think, the basics of it is make sure you obtain consent before taking someone's personal data and make sure that the data in transit, right, is protected, aka encrypted, and make sure when it's stored safely, aka encrypted, right? So I think if you want to really make it simple, make sure you obtain consent. So get a wet signature, get a digital signature, so that contract, the terms and conditions are clear. Those are your options, some of your options. And two, make sure you encrypt your information, right? So everything stays protected. I think that at the end of the day is probably the two simplest things that you could do to protect your business and protect that relationship and that trust that your customers have given you.
Excellent point. We're almost out of time. So I wanted to ask if Vivek has any last parting thoughts before we close out this panel discussion, which has been very rich and robust.
Yeah, so let me conclude by sort of giving a very simple analogy that the police is out there on the streets to protect us. And let's start viewing it that way, that good data protection and privacy laws are there to protect all of us. Now, clearly, if the police on the street do excesses, there's an impact. There is a, people don't like it. Maybe people won't go out on the streets, et cetera, et cetera. So let's sort of view it as that, that a good data protection and privacy law, and by good, that doesn't mean it's extreme. By good, it means it's fair and it's implemented well, is actually going to be very good for the industry as a whole. And last but not least, I wanted to make a plug, and I know Indonesia is going in that direction, on the importance of digital IDs here. Because clearly Indonesia, I think 95% of the adults have a national ID, and the importance of digital IDs, which is going to be critical for the entire digital infrastructure, the digital ecosystem, which will also, I think, go a long way in ensuring that data can be protected in a more efficient manner. So with that, a big thank you to all of y'all. Terima kasih.
Well said. Any parting thoughts, Nikki?
Well, thank you, Vivek, for the plug on digital ID, and that's definitely been the inspiration of my startup at Vida. So don't want to shamelessly self-promote here, but stay tuned for what's happening at Vida and digital IDs, and trying to simplify all of this for you.
Great. Well, both of you, I really appreciate learning, and also from the rest of the panel. I really have, again, an appreciation from both the government and the private sector point of view in this panel, and also from the great questions from the audience. We learn about the PDP bill before it becomes a reality, but I think there's so much interest in it right now. The success will mean that people's rights and privacy will be protected, and how it builds trust and confidence among the consumers, which is important as you support responsible innovation and competition, as what Vivek said. So perhaps Indonesia could learn and look into ASEAN as a region to explore international collaboration across border with other jurisdictions that have already implemented some of these policies, and harmonize the regulations going forward to drive greater digital economic growth in the region. At the same time, we also understand more about the role of AFTECH as a self-regulating organization to help to be in a position to work closely with the fintechs in the sandbox environment, to test out the use cases, and thereby capturing the learnings for the whole entire ecosystem. So we look forward to the new Personal Data Protection Bill to establish a strong data governance practice in Indonesia that protects the consumer and citizens while fostering greater innovation for the digital economy in the path to recovery. So thank you very much for your time today. It's a huge honor for me to participate and moderate this panel. Well, terima kasih, and I hope you have a good afternoon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Vivek. Thank you, everyone. Terima kasih. Sampai jumpa.